Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have John Epperson.
Hello, everybody.
Valentino Stoll.
Hey now.
Luke Stutters.
Hi there.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and this week we're going to be talking about Stimulus, Turbo, Hotwired, all the good stuff. And I think we're mostly just going to talk about our experience using it, maybe how we've set it up or things like that, just give people an idea of what they're looking at. As the leading digital platform for medical professionals, Doximity is transforming the healthcare industry. Founded in 2010, Doximity's mission is to help physicians save time so that they can provide better care for patients. They build secure and modern communication, workflow, and networking tools. Over 1.8 million healthcare professionals, including over 80% of U.S. doctors, rely on Doximity in their day-to-day practice. Their tools are physician-first and patient-centered. Doximity is a remote-first distributed team, and they take pride in the culture they've built. They recognize that the company is successful when people are successful. They've built a diverse team with an inclusive culture, and they're multicultural, multilingual, and international. Their diversity is their code, too. They build products with Ruby, Rails, Vue.js, and Golang. They'd like you to come join their mission to make every physician more productive so they can provide better care for their patients. Visit workat.doximity.com to see open positions, employee interviews, and Doximity in the news. I don't know necessarily that we'll go into a whole lot of depth on how it works. I think we've had people on to talk about that before, but I guess we'll get some of that. John, I think you probably have more experience than I do with a lot of this stuff. I mean, I've mostly just done Stimulus. I haven't touched most of the other pieces of Hotwired, so I don't know.
I will also admit, I haven't really played with Hotwired yet, mostly because I'm working on projects that I already have open at the moment, and they're already using Stimulus, and I'm very happy with it.
Right. So, yeah, and then Luke, you were saying that you've done a whole bunch of stuff with Turbo, which used to be Turbo Links.
So I produced Hotwired stack came in, and John and also Dave were really keen on it. So I was like, okay, we'll write some proper JavaScript now, because obviously jQuery is the best way to go, right? But fine, we'll have.
Yeah, but it's not popular, so we can't use it anymore.
Right, so we're going to have to knuckle down and learn something new, which I hate. I hate learning anything new. I just want to do the old code the old way, but fine. So I started looking at the Hotwired site, and there's a lot of confusion between Hotwire and Hotwired, because I think the website is hotwired.dev, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a huge confusion. The Turbo used to be Turbo Links, now it's just Turbo. There's a lot of namespace collisions happening, but Stimulus is out on its own. So Stimulus is really easy. I can get on board with that. Really great. And just to be a bit different, I don't use Stimulus through any kind of JavaScript package builder like Webpack or anything. I use Stimulus with a thing called Claustrophobic, which lets you pull in UMDs in JavaScript without any kind of tooling. So if you load through a thing called Claustrophobic, you can pull in, Stimulus, etc., on a totally naked, buildless setup. And once I got that working, then I implemented my own Turbo backend. So I didn't have to use Rails. I could just use kind of micro frameworks instead. And I produced a little demo, which I called my Sinatra Turbo Stimulus demo, just as like, what does that stack look like without any of the extra bits you get from Rails, like the absolute bare metal, how does it work? And yeah, I was blown away, actually. It's incredibly clean. I don't need to learn anything else once you get the hang of putting new style JavaScript in through the claustrophobic system. I don't have to learn Webpacker or keep it in my head or anything else. And you're coding like it's kind of 2002 again, really enjoying it. You just put the words on the screen, words go on a page. Really great.
Nice. So where do we start with all this stuff? I mean,
I was going to say, can somebody break this down for me? What is Hotwire?
Yeah.
What is Turbo?
How
are they all different? How do they work together?
It's a rebrand of what was already in Rails, right? It's what it is. It's marketing. It's a rebrand.
I mean, yes. Right. Like, so the major pieces of Hotwire, right, are WebSockets plus Stimulus plus, I guess, Turbo instead of Turbo Links, right? Like, and then plus like sort of in kind of an equivalent to stimulus reflux, right? So I feel like those are the four major pieces that I'm seeing, and I don't always remember the names off the top of my head for all of them, but those are, I believe, the four pieces of Hotwired. All right, I probably should I'll just go confirm this while I'm talking to make sure, but I'm pretty sure from memory.
This all came out of the app wars and DHH's Hey app, didn't it? This is where all this kind of marketing stuff, renaming, came out when he released the Hey email app. Am I right?
I don't know about that. I think some of this was coming beforehand.
This to me feels a lot like a lot of things that DHH comes out with, right? Which are that something's kind of going on in the community, and it seems like he experiments with it, plays with it for a while, and then he's like, this is what I think is the right way. And he comes out with this thing. And sometimes people like it and sometimes people don't, right? Like not everything he's made has always been like well received, but usually the things that he makes are consistent. Like they're internally consistent. If you use DHH's stuff with Rails, it mostly just works most of the time. And so you can kind of, there's some amount of, I don't know, quality, I guess, that you're like, there's a certain level of quality that you're getting by picking this stuff up. That doesn't mean that it's going to supersede and replace all the things that people were using beforehand. But the tendency in the Rails community, based on my experience, is that we sort of tend to move towards the Rails over time, right? So yes, when active storage first came out, we were all just like, don't worry about it. I'm still using, I guess we had, I think Paperclip was already deprecated at that point, but we were all using whatever it was, Carrier Wave, or like I was trying to get everyone to use Refile at the time because I thought that was super cool, that, yeah, whatever. But now I'm using active storage, right? Like it just happened. And I feel like that's the same story with like everything. It's like for a while, we kind of stick with our old tools, but we have a tendency to move towards Rails tools. So I feel like we will probably all be on Hotwire in a few years. Don't worry about it. We're all going to conform and drink the Kool-Aid eventually.
Yeah, I will admit, like on active storage, I still tend to pull in like Carrier Wave or what have you, but I eventually, I was using Sidekick or Rescue or something, and I eventually just put Active Job in and realized that it was a whole lot nicer for me to use. And so I'm starting to lean that way toward like active storage, and some of these others is like, oh, well, yeah.
So just to clarify, because I'm a little confused on this particular topic, but is this an alternative to using like Webpacker and a separate front end?
No, not at all.
No.
That's just something really strange that I've done because you can.
So
Wait,
this
Luke
replaces
did something really strange?
Right?
No, this is a competitor to using React, basically, right? Or Angular or something like that. That's probably a closer thing. It's not even, but even that isn't quite right, if that makes sense, right? So the way that you package this up and deliver it is separate from using Hotwired, right? So you could, like DHH is suggesting, use import maps in Rails 7, for example, right? You can actually, well, I don't know if you can do this with Hotwired, but I know that you can deliver stimulus over sprockets. Don't do it. It's absolute pain in the butt. But the place that I am currently doing most of my work for is we just upgraded to Rails 5. So anyway, it's a thing. We're delivering it over sprockets. That's what we're doing, right? So you can do you can also pull it down from CDN, right? So you can do it completely raw, or you can do what Luke said, pull it down over like a simpler tool like Clusterphobic, or you can pack in a Webpack and just put it in one of your packs. The way that you deliver it is agnostic from Stimulus itself, and I believe the entire Hotwired stack.
Yeah, my experience with it has been, I just used it through Webpacker. And then what we're talking about here is it has an approach that's kind of, I think of it as kind of a level up from jQuery. So jQuery would say, I have this DOM element and I'm going to attach all these events to it. And Stimulus kind of does that. So you could kind of sprinkle jQuery in where you needed it, right? You just said, I care about interactions over here and I don't care about interactions anywhere else except for over here when I hook something up to it. And so Stimulus does the same thing with the Stimulus controller, but it will interact with or watch or whatever you tell it to, all of the elements inside as well, or certain elements inside, and manage the interactions there. Where I see things like jQuery or Angular, they tend to want to take over the entire DOM, right? Because they're using Shadow DOM and they're doing all this fancy stuff in order to manage changes and keep it all happy. And so that's been the main draw for me with Stimulus, is that I can write Rails views. In fact, I had a debate with another former coworker of mine when I was at Morgan Stanley, and we had brought in React for certain parts of the app, and we were using Stimulus in other parts of the app, and we were talking about, hey, why aren't we just using one or the other, right? And so he was an advocate for React, and he's like, React does all these things for you, and Stimulus doesn't do any of these things for you, right? And he kept making the point that, so React is fully featured, and so we should use it. And I turned around and I said, yeah, but Rails does all of those things for you and more, right? And the point is that I can server render with Rails all of my stuff, and then where I need the JavaScript-based interactivity, then I just drop Stimulus on it, right? And I say, okay, when I click here, do this, right, in JavaScript, or when this changes, do this. So you have a pretty finite set of events that you're watching that are pretty common, and you just make it work. And so the thing that's nice about it is then all of the other features that people are using React for or Angular for, I just use Rails for, and then I just kind of add the rest of it in. You bring in turbo links so that you get the faster partial page reloads, or not turbo links, turbo, sorry. You bring in some of these other features and pieces so that you get whatever other features you need. You kind of can pick and choose the pieces of Hotwire you want in the app. And that's been the real draw for me, is just that, you know what, I don't have to go and learn React in order to get an interactive experience in my app. I can just bring in Stimulus and say, look, if you're within this thing, attach a Stimulus controller to it, and then just do the interactions that I tell you I care about. And that's it. And so it keeps the stack pretty small. But yeah, to John's point, it's just another library at that point. So then you just bring it in through Webpack or what have you, and it just runs.
Just to add a little bit to what Chuck is saying, to make sure that we're addressing the question directly, the way that I see it, and I think what Chuck is saying is that he's agreeing with this, right? Like Stimulus itself, separate from Hotwired, is more or less giving you an alternative to React and Angular and all those other frameworks. It is a different architecture, like a way of thinking about building your applications, right? It's returning us more towards the reactive thing versus React and Angular, and most of these fronts and frameworks are, the way that I see it is they need so much state, right? Like the way that they work, right, is they're like, look, we're tracking your state on the page and all this stuff, right? So it results in sort of like this black hole that's constantly pulling in more and more stuff. And it's sort of competing with your backend app for your time and your attention and your need to care for it. And Stimulus doesn't need that, because Stimulus is just it's literally just reactive, right? It's literally just going back to the place where we were in jQuery, which is like, this event happens on the page and I want it to happen here. The difference, and why like we care about this, and we're not, because you'd be like, okay, well, I don't want to go back to jQuery. jQuery sucked, which is kind of true in some respects, right?
It's definitely true.
But
well, it worked. It did it when anyway.
Yeah, well, the things that we hated about jQuery, right? The arguments that I remember when we started graduating from jQuery to all these front ends, right, was I have to write all this boilerplate code, and I do the same thing on every page, and I have to keep writing the same code over and over again. Wouldn't it be awesome if I could refactor that, right? And have like these little widgets that I can take from, write once and take it from here and have it work over here and things like this, right? And the idea was I could dry up my code. Stimulus does that without requiring me to have the immense overhead that comes with running all these frameworks, because the way that these frameworks deliver that to you is, like I said, they completely change the paradigm on the page to being one of their tracking state and all of this stuff, right? Rather than being reactive to things. So the way the Stimulus works, it says, you know what? Your DOM is your state, and it has always been your state, right? I don't need to copy my state into React additionally, right? So it says my DOM is my state, and it really does work. It works amazingly, which is why I literally am drooling over it all the time on this show and everywhere else. So yeah, does that help to at least address the question, Valentino? I'm trying
think
to
so.
not pour my opinion on.
Looking at some of the turbo examples, it almost looks like it's a replacement for like server-side rendered components in React, or I mean, some ways. I know there's a lot
Yes.
of other cruft, if you will, built into it with relation to like their
What
streaming
kills me with React
over WebSocket.
is the reason that is having to write everything twice. Yeah, you always end up running everything twice in a React app. Now, if you've got a JavaScript backend like Node, it's not a big deal because you never switch languages. But if you're running a React front end with a Rails backend,
I'm going to stop you right there.
Complexity, you always end up running twice.
Writing your code and using it both on the front and the back end.
No,
I won't say it's a total pipe dream.
Kind of thing implemented once in JavaScript and another time in Ruby on the back end.
Right. I'm just saying the people who go and do Express and then React, they wind up writing it once in JavaScript and another time in JavaScript. Occasionally you can get some of your business logic to transfer, but everything else, and even then, it's not perfect.
He wasn't knocking your main point, Luke. He was knocking an aside that you made somewhere in there.
Yeah, where if it's in the same language, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't have to write it twice.
So are you saying, Chuck, hold on, I need to clarify this really quick. Are you saying that the people that are in the JavaScript community have also come to the realization that React is this black hole that's sucking everything in off of our servers?
You know, a lot of people are getting there, actually.
That's awesome.
I mean, the thing is that the people that I don't see getting there are typically the people who are either writing all front end or all back end in JavaScript.
Ah, yes, because they're only writing one of them. They don't see the second right. Got it.
So speaking of React, can you use React or Vue or one of these other JS frameworks on top of Turbo, or is it specific to Stimulus?
I know that you could write React with Turbo links, and I did, and I don't know that it was the best, but we did. I will also say that there is some amount of competing for like load events and things like that, right? Like there's some amount of overlap there. And so you have to come up with a way to like kind of resolve that stuff. That's probably going to be custom to your app. And my understanding is that Turbo does a little bit more than Turbo Links, but I believe that Turbo is like, it has Turbo Links kind of, or it's like, I don't know. I don't remember if it was a re-architecture or not off the top of my head, but it's at least in the spirit of it. So I don't know. I don't know if you have the same problems.
Yeah.
Some of that is I'll discover the first time that I do a Hotwire application. Actually, I won't, because I'll just be using Stimulus and it'll just be amazing. But
I'll tell you that Stimulus and React,
I have no idea. It could be terrible.
Are not always friends. I mean, sometimes it just works. But the problem that you run into, and I would assume that Turbo may or may not have the same problem. Turbo is kind of a bigger, like it moves bigger pieces of your DOM, and so what the issue turns out to be in most cases is that React wants to keep track of all the changes to the DOM and manage them all. And so if you're making changes to your DOM with something like Stimulus or something else, then if React misses the change that you made, then you start to have problems. Or if React is assuming that you made a change that you didn't make, that also turns out to be a problem. And so I could see that Turbo coming in and kind of reconstructing a whole big piece of the DOM would be less of an issue, right? Because it's a giant red flag for React to go, I got to figure out what's going on here. Whereas some of the smaller changes that I've made with Stimulus in an app that had React doing other stuff in it, it turned out to be weird. So
I think that's a good distinction, right? So in a React app, right, the React classes and everything, right, they are the final authoritative source for like what's going on the page, at least from React's perspective, right?
Yep.
Whereas when you're looking at the page / when you're using Stimulus and things like that, and a lot of other things, the authoritative source is the DOM itself. Yeah. So it's just a little bit different, and it ends up being, I just wanted to make the distinction to clarify what I said earlier.
Yeah. So the thing that I really like though about Stimulus is that, I just pick and choose when I need it. And one thing that I've done with it that's a little bit different than what I've seen other people do, and this is something I picked up from Jared Reed, who was a coworker of mine at Morgan Stanley and a couple of other places where I either hired him or he hired me. We've done that a few times. Effectively, what he wound up doing was he extended Webpack to look at the view controllers folder for the view controllers gem. And so then what would happen is when you built a component, you would just add a stimulus controller to the components folder, right? So he did the sidecar implementation where you have the component file in the main folder, and then you have the HTML and CSS and everything else in its own folder, and you would just drop the stimulus component in there too, and so, or controller in there too, and then you would just wire up that controller to the component that it was corresponding to, and it made things really, really clean because all the JavaScript interactions for the view component were encapsulated in its accompanying stimulus controller. And so if you needed to know where something was, it was just right there. It almost felt like an extension of Rails with view components. And so that's where I really started to see the power of it, because then it's like, oh, I can connect all the dots, and it makes it really, really convenient. And so that's the way I've been doing things for the last while with Stimulus, and I have really, really loved it that way.
I came to it out of Vue. So I had a big Vue app, and like I said, you end up with the same situation. It's not as bad as React because you don't have to learn a whole new language of JSX and just put rubbish everywhere on your code base. But you still end up with this kind of hitting it twice thing. And it was quite nice to go from the Vue angle where you have a similar encapsulation to Stimulus. So you have the idea of here's your block, here's your thing, and all the code related to that thing goes into this block. So it's easy to find, but it does a lot less for you than Vue does. So you can pull in some kind of really nice pre-made components in Vue. None of that stuff exists in the Stimulus framework.
Actually, that's not true, and I'll make sure to add this at the end. There's actually a bunch of like pre-made components. They're not like advertised on like the Stimulus JS page. It's just like people in the community have made these, and there's some really high quality ones or whatever. And I'll link, or I
told you, John, I don't like learning things, and here you are expanding my knowledge again.
I'm sorry. I'll try and, never teach you anything. But yeah, there's some awesome pre-built components that are super helpful. I myself haven't really used them raw because I've always found that I needed to extend them in some way. I don't know if that's everybody's experience, but that's just been mine so far. But it's not hard to extend them, and it's been really great.
I think that's pretty cool.
I definitely want to throw that in there.
With the other frameworks too, where you pull in the Vue components or the like Vue.js pre-made components and stuff. Like sometimes you can just use them as they come, but most of the time you're customizing it one way or the other, right? So you pull in the Bootstrap or what's the Google one, material design or something like that, and then you customize it. So unless you have a pre-built theme that somebody else has already put together for you, where you're just saying, okay, I want theirs instead of the originals, you might up
Oh, I meant
customizing them anyway.
Yeah, I meant behavior-wise, right?
Yeah, that too.
Because Stimulus, right? One of the awesome pieces about Stimulus is Stimulus works regardless of your CSS, regardless of, your layout, because you just say data, whatever my controller is named -target, right?
Yep.
Whatever it is. And then Stimulus goes, oh, that's the thing I'm supposed to pay attention to. I don't care. Like, it doesn't care what element type it is or anything, it just, once you plug that little data thing in there, it knows. So the thing is that allows you to do, you can take two completely different HTML blurbs that look completely different inside, and they can fit into the same controller just fine. So, for example, like and this Valentino is what I always thought and what I always wanted out of React, right? Like I always wanted the little widget type idea, right? Like I always wanted to be able to say, okay, this is my like collapsible widget, right? Like I feel like collapsible was like the thing that we always wanted, right? Like, sweet, I can close this thing, open this thing, right? Like, I don't care what's inside of it. I don't care if I'm using a little arrow down thing on this one or the sideways carré on this other one, right? Like, I should just be able to say, this thing is what makes it collapsible. And there were some things in jQuery that kind of got us close or whatever, but there was always quirkiness to all this stuff. But in Stimulus, that stuff is like smooth as butter, and like, it just is. And you can go download a collapsible thing off the internet and just straight up works out of the box. You can nest them inside of each other and they work out of the box too. There's a lot of coolness to coolness is the wrong thing here. The fact is that like coolness. This is actually delivering the thing that I wanted 10 years ago.
Yeah.
That's one thing I've always missed from a lot of these frameworks. Yeah, I mean, there's a framework called Storybook that is kind of taken over a lot of this responsibility for previewing contained components and being able to, modify them and extend them easily. And a lot of design teams are adopting that for their design systems, but it's definitely something like an open source shared library is definitely missing, I think, from a lot of these frameworks that's like native, right? Where you can say import from this external package and it would make that component available to you. And I feel like there's still a long way to go there. I haven't seen anything that has come close to that outside of like Bulma or something like that, where you kind of like adopting a giant UI system to get some of those features.
Did you feel like Storybook like was like super awesome? Like I felt like my experience with like the whole Storybook thing was that like there was, I worked on 2 apps that like had stuff that like we just couldn't get to work with Storybook like very well, or it was so difficult that we like bailed. Maybe we could have gotten it to work, but we ended up, just choosing a different path in the end. And I felt like Storybook was like, it seemed like people really liked it, but the 2 times that I like tried to make it work, like it just, we ended up bailing for one reason or another. One time it was me trying to implement it. The other time it was somebody else. So I was just kind of curious. Do you feel like it's either A, like maybe gotten better and maybe it was just terrible a while back, or terrible, sorry, or is not as good a while back, or B, like maybe it's just my experience or whatever. Go ahead.
It could be your experience. I mean, I personally haven't had that experience of having trouble implementing components. It's pretty abstract. So maybe things have changed since you last touched it. But I would say it's definitely more advantageous if you are starting with a design system than trying to implement your own. Or if you're starting from scratch, it might be a little more difficult. I don't know. I personally, I haven't had an issue. It does take some getting used to the kind of syntax of it, which is where...
that was my issue.
Yeah.
It was, hey, we've got this documented. Here's what it's supposed to look like. Here's how it all kind of hangs together. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to go put this component into my app. Wait, how in the fetch do I get it into my app? And what are all these values that are magically showing up in it?
Time is of the essence when identifying and resolving issues in your software. And our friends at Raygun are here to help. Their brand new alerting feature is now available for crash reporting and real user monitoring to make sure you're quickly notified of the errors, crashes, and front-end performance issues that matter most to you and your business. Set thresholds for your alert based on an increase in error count, a spike in load time, or new issues introduced in the latest deployment, along with custom filters that give you even greater control. Assign multiple users to ensure the right team members are notified, with alerts linked directly to the issue in Raygun, taking you to the root cause faster. Never miss another mission-critical issue in your software again. Try Raygun Alerting today and create a world-class issue resolution workflow that gives you and your customer peace of mind. Visit raygun.com to learn more. Their simple usage plans start from as little as $4 per month with unlimited apps and users. That's raygun.com to start your free 14-day trial.
It's kind of like adopting Stimulus, right? Mm-hmm. Like that Stimulus has a bunch of known configurations and details that you have to know about the data targets and the lifecycle hooks. Very similarly, Storybook has its own stuff that you have to be able to follow. And then once you do, it's very easy to churn stuff out. I mean, it's kind of like the trade-offs, right? Like if you're planning to dive in and make it easy for people to experiment with components and implement them, and you don't want them to have to read through a bunch of code to know how to use them, Storybook is a huge advantage in that way. Or, other design system frameworks like that, where they just offer that benefit at the disadvantage of the onboarding, right? Of getting used to that syntax.
I will say that by the time Storybook came out, React had already gone through like a while of, changing and stuff. And I had been kind of using it like pretty much the whole time. Right. And like I'd already kind of felt like a little bit of, but I want to say it was like React, whatever the 14, I don't remember if it was like 1.14 or whatever, but I think it was like the 14 upgrade where like some major like architectural choices were like really changed, and like there was a lot of like arguments and everything was about like composability and things, except that they were using the word very differently than everyone else uses the word and things like that. So there was a lot of like baggage. Okay, so summarize it all, right? Like I already had a lot of baggage with React at this point, and I think I could definitely say that by the time I was at least aware of Storybook, I was already reevaluating whether React was really serving what I had intended it, what I thought it was giving me at all. And at the time, for a couple of years, like there was nothing. Like Stimulus didn't come out for a couple more years, and I didn't really feel like any of the other frameworks offered me any other advantages. I don't think even Vue was out at that time either.
I will say my experience with Storybook is exclusively Vue.js, so maybe that experience is different than working with React and Storybook.
Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah, I remember when I remember looking into Vue and being like, this is awesome. It's changing a lot of things. And then being like, nope, it's going the same way that React did. It's turning into the same thing. And so then I became jaded very quickly. Well, okay. So at the end of the day, right? Like I'm not, okay. So my goal here isn't necessarily to rag on them, but to like describe like my state of mind, right? Which is that like I bought into React because of this promise that I was going to be able to make these self-contained widgets that I could just plop all over my pages, whatever page they were, and that was going to be super awesome, right? I was just going to be able to sprinkle them everywhere. And I found that wasn't really true. Like there was just too much, like I always had to do too much setup, too many things. And as that time went on, it was still providing enough value that I kept doing it, right? Like I still felt like I was getting more value than over going back to jQuery, right? So I still kept using it, but it wasn't getting me to that Elysium that I wanted to get to, right? Like I just never made it to those fields. And then, Vue came out. And so what I was saying here is like, I was like, oh, sweet. It's a little bit of a different spin, but it looks like really good. And then I just felt like it went down the same road that React went down, where it was just kind of like swallowing up my page. And then so then Stimulus came out, and I was like, this is actually the thing that I thought that I was getting all along. And so that's been my state of mind. And that's what I definitely have always tried to tell people is I feel like when we were first looking into frameworks, right, back when Backbone and Angular 1, which is completely different than Angular 2, right, and Ember like all came out, right? Yeah. Like the entire thing that I remember people talking about was, I just want to be able to write something once and plop it as a widget over everything. I felt like that was the predominant thing that we all wanted. And I just felt like I never got that. Like we kept trying different things, but we didn't get it for 10 years. And I felt like Stimulus was sort of like the long prophesized thing. And so like, I do feel like you could consider me a little bit fanatical about it. And so I want to make sure that like, I am admitting to this, right? But I do really believe in it. So hopefully that explains that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
but there are some. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, we have shows on Angular, React, and Vue. I've played quite a bit with all of them. And I mean, what you're talking about, John, is effectively a big part of my issue with them is that, yeah, they want to manage everything, and they don't necessarily need to. It means that I have to learn 2 technology stacks instead of 1. And yeah, I mean, everything has to happen within the context of an Angular app or it won't work, or a Vue app and it won't work. And so, yeah, there's this huge amount of setup that you have to do instead of just saying, I want that there and I want it to behave this way. You have to go do all the other setup. There's a whole lot of ceremony around a lot of this stuff that just, I feel like is unnecessary, that Stimulus gets out of your way.
It's interesting to me to see this progression more in the point of view of a front end team, right? So people who aren't necessarily working with Rails or Ruby directly, they may go in and modify some views, right? Vue component architecture from GitHub has definitely helped relieve a lot of the anxiety, I think, from front end teams in that way. And back end, right? Because the back end can test and the front end can still make changes without too much of difficulty. So I'm kind of interested to see what your guys' thoughts are on where Stimulus kind of fits into that front end realm and how easy you guys feel it would be for front end specific teams to come in and make changes. to scenario, and I was talking more specifically to scenarios that involve the turbo side or Rails side, where they have some conditional views or something like that they would need to modify. Is that still straightforward, or is there still some conflict there?
I think it's the same problem that's persisted across the Rails community from the very beginning, right? Which is that we have our assets separated from our view folders. I do think that view components, specifically the thing that like Google is taking care of, or I'm sorry, GitHub is taking care of right now, right? And actually, to be frank, I actually talked with, gosh, I'm so terrible with names, and I apologize, guys, but the guy that's taking care of view components or whatever, I talked with him actually at RubyConf, and there's how should I put this? There is positive belief that this actually could be a thing that, becomes more supported by like Rails going forward. That's no guarantee of anything. I'm not promising anything, but there's definitely positive belief that it's moving forward. And I know that conversation has been up and down over the past few years. But I do think that I agree with you that, like, in my opinion, I don't think that I'm alone. Like, especially, it was super validating to hear you say it, right? That you like view components or whatever is kind of what I heard you just say. I also believe that view components are actually a phenomenal way to basically expose that to front-end devs. I think it's awesome, and I kind of really hope that we go that way as a community whole, because I think that I don't just think it because I think it exposes to front-end devs. I think that is a thing that will help back-end devs like handle stuff a little bit better. And there's some good stimulus integration with view components. I know that there's some edge cases and things, and I don't know what the edge cases are like, for example, from like the view side, for example, right? So I don't know what the edge cases that you run into are. I know that there's some edge cases around stimulus. I know that I was talking with Andrew Mason a while back, and there's definitely some stimulus reflux edge cases with view components because they were having some trouble with that. They used view components very heavily. What was the ad place that they were working at or whatever? Yep, they had like a bunch of view components over at Code Sponsor. They used it very heavily. Yeah. So that's where I sit on that.
Yeah, for me,
I kind of really hope we go that way. Otherwise, we're left with the old thing, which is assets folder over here, whether that's in your, Webpacker packs folder, right?
App JavaScript or app assets.
Yep. But it's still separated from your view folder, right? Is the point, which, and that's separated from your helpers folder, which we all kind of do a little bit of that too. So that stuff being separated, I think is what you're getting at, right? Like that's always been a hassle for front end people. That, at least that's the biggest complaint that I've always like kind of fielded from that direction.
Yeah, I'll just chime in because I mean I've had a little bit different experience. So like I said, Jared set things up so that our stimulus controllers lived in the same folders as our HTML and CSS for our view components.
Yeah, you said that.
And so what you're talking about there, I mean, that was so nice because everything kind of lived in the same place, which is actually what Uncle Bob means by single responsibility principle. It's not that class only has one job. What he said is, in the talks that I've seen him give, is that single responsibility principle means all the stuff that's likely to change at the same time is located in the same place. And so that really opens up a lot of possibilities there. And I'll put a link to Jared's articles where he actually explains how he set up stimulus that way. But the other thing is that as far as like front end developers being able to modify stuff and how user friendly is it for them? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the front end developer really meant that you were kind of a glorified designer. And so I don't know. I mean, nowadays you're not just managing CSS and a handful of jQuery plugins. You're actually managing something that actually looks at the DOM and manages the DOM, right? And it's a full library to manage the DOM. Whereas, stimulus isn't that, right? It manages only the parts of the DOM that you tell it to care about. And even then it goes and looks at the DOM, right? Sets up the listeners that it needs and then just effectively reacts to it. So I don't know that you would even have front-end developers in the way we think about them today, right? I think you'd be going back to kind of the
web design
plugin
era.
land. Yeah, well, and I mean, JavaScript and front-end have kind of evolved to the point where you could have front-end developers that mostly focus into stimulus, but I don't think their whole job would be managing that kind of stuff, right? They would be adding features and functionality, and they would have more of the front end stimulus bent to what they're doing within the context of a Rails or other web app, as opposed to all they do is focus on React and then coordinate with the backend folks when they need data or state. And so I don't know. I mean, if you brought somebody in who had that full front end, and this was the debate we had over and over again at Morgan Stanley, was that the guy who was deep into React, he was going, well, what do I even do if we go with stimulus? And it's like, well, you write Ruby and then you write JavaScript where you need it, just like we've been doing this whole time. And so I don't know. I mean, to that extent, it changes the way that you think about your team structure. But the flip side is that anybody who's familiar enough with the core concepts of web development, whether you're talking HTML, CSS, JavaScript, things like that. I mean, none of it's mysterious, right? It's all right there in front of you, and it uses the same concepts. It just organizes them a little bit differently. And so a competent front-end developer would be able to pick up stimulus without too much trouble. I think the key halfway answer
is that you're shifting the work.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, I think the key thing is you're shifting the work out of all of this React specific work into, because you're going to basically render all this stuff server side using your ERB, whether you're using HAML or Slim, whatever, it's still ERB under the hood, right? You're going to render almost everything using ERB, and then you're just going to have a lot more sprinkling rather than a huge app on the front end.
Yeah.
On one of his blogs when they launched the Hotwire stack, I think it was one of the Hay blogs, PHX said something very interesting, which was that he felt like this framework